Picture this. You've just met someone who seems perfect. He's charming, attentive, and everything feels right. But something deep inside whispers that things are moving too fast. You brush it off because you don't want to seem paranoid or jaded. 3 months later, you find yourself walking on eggshells, doubting your own judgment and wondering how you missed the signs that were there from the very beginning. Here's the truth that nobody wants to tell you. Those red flags you dismissed, they weren't accidents, they weren't quirks. They weren't things that would get better with time. They were deliberate patterns of behavior designed to test your boundaries, and you passed his test by ignoring your intuition. Today, we're going to talk about 6 toxic habits that men show early on, habits that specifically target women over 40 who are dating again after divorce, loss, or simply taking a break from relationships. These aren't the obvious red flags that everyone talks about. These are the subtle, insidious behaviors that slip under your radar because they're disguised as charm, interest, or even love. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to look for, why these behaviors are dangerous, and most importantly, how to protect yourself without becoming cynical or closed off to genuine connection. Welcome back to The Heart Code, where we decode the hidden patterns in relationships and help you navigate the complex world of dating with wisdom, dignity, and self-respect. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to women like you, women who have lived, loved, learned, and are now ready to date smarter, not harder. Before we dive deep into today's topic, I want you to do me a favor. If you find value in this video, if something resonates with you, or if you learn something that could protect you or someone you love, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube that this content matters and helps us reach more women who need to hear this message. Drop a comment below sharing your experiences or thoughts, because your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear to trust her instincts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss content that could change your life. For those of you who want to go beyond just watching and really support the work we do here, consider leaving a super thanks. Your support allows us to keep creating in-depth, research-backed content that prioritizes your well-being over clickbait. Every contribution, no matter how small, makes a real difference. Now, let's talk about why this topic matters specifically for women over 40. When you're dating in your 20s or 30s, you often have the luxury of time. You can afford to date the wrong person for a year or two, learn the lessons, and move on without it significantly impacting your life trajectory. But when you're over 40, time feels different. You're not interested in wasting years on someone who isn't right for you. You've already invested decades in building a life, raising children, establishing a career, or recovering from heartbreak. You know what you want and you know what you don't want. This clarity is your superpower, but it also makes you a target for a specific type of man. These men recognize that women over 40 often have financial stability, emotional maturity, established homes, and most importantly, a desire for genuine partnership without the drama of youth. They see your maturity as an opportunity rather than appreciating it as a gift. They know that you're less likely to play games, which ironically makes you more vulnerable to their games. These men have studied what works. They've refined their approach through trial and error with countless women. They know exactly which buttons to push, which words to say, and which behaviors will slip past your defenses. They understand that women over 40 often carry specific vulnerabilities, such as feeling invisible in a youth-obsessed dating culture, worrying that good men are taken, or believing that they need to be more flexible and understanding because they're no longer young. What makes these toxic habits so dangerous is their subtlety. They don't show up as obvious abuse or disrespect in the beginning. They show up as intensity, passion, attentiveness, and interest. They feel like someone finally seeing you, valuing you, and wanting you in a world that often makes older women feel overlooked. This is precisely why you need to know what to look for. The 6 habits we're about to discuss are patterns I've observed through years of working with women, studying relationship psychology, and analyzing the stories of countless women who found themselves in toxic situations despite being intelligent, experienced, and self-aware. These aren't theories. These are real patterns backed by real experiences. One more thing before we begin. Recognizing these patterns doesn't mean you need to become suspicious of every man you meet. It doesn't mean you should build walls around your heart or approach dating with cynicism. What it means is that you should date with your eyes open, trust your instincts, and remember that genuine love doesn't require you to ignore warning signs or compromise your peace of mind. Healthy relationships develop at a comfortable pace. They make you feel safe, seen, and respected from day one. They enhance your life rather than consuming it. If something feels off, if your gut is telling you to slow down, if you find yourself making excuses for behavior that makes you uncomfortable, that's not paranoia, that's wisdom trying to protect you. So let's get into it. Here are 6 toxic habits men show early on that women over 40 absolutely need to recognize. Toxic habit number 1, intense instant intimacy. The first toxic habit is what I call intense instant intimacy, and it's perhaps the most seductive of all red flags because it feels so good in the moment. You meet him, and within the first conversation, he's telling you things he claims he's never told anyone before. He's sharing deep vulnerabilities, childhood wounds, and dreams for the future. He looks into your eyes with an intensity that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. He says things like, "I feel like I've known you forever," or "I can't believe how easy it is to talk to you," or "I've never felt this kind of connection with anyone." For a woman over 40, especially one who may have felt invisible in the dating world or who has experienced relationships where emotional intimacy was lacking, this feels like a miracle. Finally, a man who isn't afraid to be vulnerable. Finally, someone who wants real connection, not just surface-level small talk. Finally, a man who sees past your age and recognizes the depth of who you are. But here's what's really happening. This isn't genuine intimacy. This is a calculated strategy called love bombing, and it serves multiple purposes for a toxic man. First, it creates a false sense of closeness very quickly. When someone shares deep personal information with you early on, your brain interprets this as trust and connection. You feel special because he's chosen you to confide in. This triggers a psychological principle called reciprocity, where you feel compelled to match his level of vulnerability and share your own deep truths. Suddenly, within days or weeks, you feel bonded to him in a way that would typically take months or years to develop naturally. Second, it bypasses your natural defenses. When you date at a normal pace, you have time to observe how someone behaves in different situations, how they treat other people, how they handle stress or conflict, and whether their words match their actions. But intense instant intimacy creates an emotional whirlwind where you're so focused on the feelings and the connection that you stop observing and evaluating. You stop asking critical questions because questioning feels like betrayal when someone has been so vulnerable with you. Third, it creates an unspoken obligation. He's been so open, so honest, so emotionally available. How can you now pull back or express doubts? Doing so would make you seem cold, closed off, or emotionally unavailable. This is exactly what he wants because it prevents you from enforcing boundaries or slowing things down even when your instincts tell you to. Fourth, it establishes a pattern where emotional intensity substitutes for genuine compatibility and shared values. You become addicted to the feeling of the connection rather than evaluating whether this person is actually right for you. The relationship becomes about maintaining that intense emotional high rather than building something sustainable and healthy. Let me give you a concrete example. Sarah, a 52-year-old woman who had been divorced for 3 years, met Michael on a dating app. Their first date lasted 6 hours. He told her about his difficult childhood, his ex-wife who didn't understand him, and his dreams of finding a partner who could match his emotional depth. He cried when talking about his mother's death. He held Sarah's hand and told her he felt like he could tell her anything. Sarah was overwhelmed with compassion and connection. She felt like she'd finally met a man who wasn't emotionally stunted, who could actually be vulnerable and real. She shared her own story of divorce, her struggles with feeling invisible as an older woman, and her fears about dating again. By the end of the night, they both felt like they'd known each other forever. Within 2 weeks, Michael was talking about their future together. He wanted her to meet his children. He suggested they take a trip together. He texted her constantly with deep, emotional messages about how she'd changed his life. Sarah felt like she was living in a romance novel. But here's what Sarah didn't notice in those early weeks. Michael never asked about her boundaries around communication or time together. He never respected when she said she needed a night to herself. He became upset if she didn't respond to his texts within an hour. He started showing up at her house unannounced because he missed her. When she gently suggested they slow down, he became emotional and asked if she didn't feel the same connection he did. The intense instant intimacy had served its purpose. It had created a bond so quickly that Sarah felt guilty for having normal concerns about the pace and intensity of the relationship. She felt like she would be betraying their special connection if she enforced boundaries or asked him to respect her space. She started doubting her own instincts because how could something that felt so right be wrong? 6 months later, Sarah found herself in a relationship where she had no personal space, where Michael's needs and emotions dominated every interaction, where she was constantly managing his feelings and walking on eggshells to avoid his emotional outbursts when she asserted any independence. The man who had seemed so emotionally open had used that openness as a trap. So how do you recognize the difference between genuine vulnerability and intense instant intimacy designed to manipulate? Genuine vulnerability develops gradually and is balanced with curiosity about you. A healthy man will share personal information, but he'll also ask questions about your life, your experiences, and your feelings. He'll respect your pace and won't push you to share more than you're comfortable with. He'll understand that real intimacy takes time to build and can't be rushed. Genuine vulnerability includes imperfection without excuse-making. A healthy man might share challenges from his past, but he'll take responsibility for his part and show evidence of growth. He won't dump his entire trauma history on you in the first date as a way to explain away current bad behavior or to position himself as a victim who needs your rescue. Genuine vulnerability respects boundaries. If you suggest slowing down or express that you need more time before sharing certain things, a healthy man will respect that without taking it personally or making you feel guilty. He won't use his vulnerability as leverage to pressure you into matching his intensity. Genuine vulnerability is consistent over time. A healthy man who is genuinely emotionally available will maintain that openness as the relationship develops, not just use it as a tool in the beginning and then shut down once you're hooked. Watch for whether his vulnerability continues to flow both ways, or whether it becomes a one-way street where you're expected to provide emotional support, but your needs are dismissed. If a man is sharing deep personal information on the first or second date, if he's talking about love or soulmates within weeks, if he's creating an us against the world narrative before you've even established who the US really is, slow down. This isn't the beginning of a great love story. This is the setup for a toxic dynamic. Your response to intense instant intimacy should be to pump the brakes gently but firmly. Thank him for sharing, but don't feel obligated to match his level of disclosure. Maintain your boundaries around communication frequency and time spent together. Watch to see how he responds when you assert your need for pacing. A healthy man will respect this. A toxic man will escalate his intensity, become hurt or angry, or try to make you feel guilty for not matching his feelings. Remember, genuine connection doesn't require intensity to prove itself. Healthy love feels safe, not overwhelming. It builds gradually like a strong foundation, not like a firework that burns bright and fast before fizzling out. If someone is rushing you toward intimacy, ask yourself what they're trying to bypass and why they need things to move so quickly. Toxic habit number 2, strategic self-deprecation. The second toxic habit is strategic self-deprecation, and it's one of the most overlooked red flags because it sounds like humility. He tells you he's been hurt before and struggles to trust. He says he knows he has issues and is working on them. He admits to being a work in progress. He shares stories about past relationship failures and positions himself as the one who messed up, who wasn't enough, who drove away good women because of his flaws. For a woman over 40 who values self-awareness and emotional growth, this sounds refreshing. Finally, a man who can admit his imperfections instead of pretending to be perfect or blaming all his problems on his exes. Finally, someone who is doing the work and is honest about his struggles. This seems like maturity, like exactly the kind of man you should give a chance to. But strategic self-deprecation is not the same as genuine self-awareness. It's a manipulation tactic that serves several calculated purposes. First, it lowers your standards and expectations. When he tells you up front that he's flawed and still working on himself, you unconsciously adjust your expectations downward. When he does something hurtful, disrespectful, or inappropriate, you remember that he warned you he has issues. You give him more chances than you would give someone who presented themselves as having their act together. You become his therapist, his mother, his rehabilitation project instead of his equal partner. Second, it positions him as the victim of his own shortcomings rather than someone responsible for his behavior. When he cancels plans last minute, when he doesn't follow through on commitments, when he treats you poorly, he can point back to his self-deprecation and say, "I told you I was a mess," or "I warned you I wasn't good at relationships." This shifts responsibility away from him and subtly onto you for choosing to be with someone who told you he wasn't ready or capable. Third, it creates a savior dynamic where you feel compelled to prove to him that he's worthy of love despite his flaws. Women over 40 often have strong nurturing instincts honed through years of caring for others, whether children, aging parents, or friends in crisis. A man using strategic self-deprecation taps into this nurturing instinct and turns it into a trap. You become invested in helping him see his worth, heal his wounds, and become the best version of himself. Your relationship becomes about his journey rather than a mutual partnership. Fourth, it prevents you from holding him accountable because doing so would make you seem harsh or unsupportive. If you express frustration with his behavior, he can respond with, "You're right, I'm terrible at this. I told you I wasn't good enough for you." Now you're in a position where you have to comfort him instead of addressing the legitimate issue you raised. Your concerns get dismissed, and somehow you end up apologizing for having needs or standards. Fifth, it creates a contrast effect that makes minimal effort seem exceptional. When someone has set the bar extremely low by telling you how flawed they are, any half-decent behavior feels like progress and growth. You find yourself grateful for basic respect, consistency, or kindness that should be the bare minimum in any relationship. You celebrate him for doing what any decent partner should do automatically, because he's framed himself as someone who struggles with even the basics. Let me share a real example. Jennifer, age 47, met David at a community event. On their second date, David told her he had been in therapy for commitment issues and knew he had a pattern of pulling away. When things got serious, he said he'd hurt past partners by not being emotionally available, and he wanted to be upfront about his struggles because he was really working on himself this time. Jennifer appreciated his honesty. She'd been with men who pretended to be perfect only to reveal major issues months into the relationship. David's transparency felt like a breath of fresh air. She told him she respected his self-awareness and was willing to take things slow while he continued working on himself. For the first month, David was attentive and present, but then he started pulling away. He'd go days without calling or texting. He'd make plans and cancel at the last minute. When Jennifer expressed that this hurt her feelings, David would say, "You're right, I'm doing it again. I'm so sorry. I told you I struggle with this. I'm really trying, but it's hard for me." Jennifer found herself comforting him instead of addressing her own hurt. She'd reassure him that she understood, that she believed he was trying, that she wasn't giving up on him. She started walking on eggshells, afraid that expressing her needs would trigger his commitment issues and push him away. 6 months in, Jennifer realized she was in a relationship where her needs consistently came second to his struggles. She was constantly adjusting her expectations, accepting behavior that didn't align with her values, and spending more energy managing his feelings about his issues than actually addressing how his behavior affected her. The self-awareness he'd presented early on was just an excuse for continuing the same patterns without taking real responsibility for change. So how do you distinguish between genuine self-awareness and strategic self-deprecation? Genuine self-awareness includes concrete action toward change. A man who is truly working on himself will tell you what he's doing about his issues, whether that's therapy, reading, coaching, or specific behavior changes he's implementing. He won't just name his problems and expect you to accept them as permanent fixtures. He'll show you through consistent action that he's actively addressing his struggles. Genuine self-awareness doesn't excuse current bad behavior. A healthy man might acknowledge past patterns, but he'll make it clear that he's committed to not repeating them with you. He won't use his awareness of his issues as a get-out-of-jail-free card every time he messes up. He'll take full responsibility without deflecting to his general flaws. Genuine self-awareness welcomes accountability. If you point out behavior that bothers you, a genuinely self-aware man will listen, validate your feelings, and work with you to address the issue. He won't turn it into an opportunity to beat himself up or make you feel guilty for holding him to standards. He'll treat accountability as a tool for growth, not as an attack on his character. Genuine self-awareness is balanced with acknowledgement of strengths. A healthy man will be aware of both his areas for growth and his positive qualities. Strategic self-deprecation tends to be one-sided, focusing entirely on flaws without any recognition of strengths. This creates an imbalanced dynamic where you're expected to constantly build him up, rather than experiencing a mutual exchange of support and appreciation. When a man leads with his flaws and struggles, pay attention to whether he's genuinely working on change or whether he's simply cataloging issues he has no intention of addressing. Pay attention to whether his self-deprecation leads to better behavior over time or whether it's a static excuse that never leads to growth. Your response to strategic self-deprecation should be to take him at his word the first time. If he tells you he's not ready for a relationship, believe him. If he tells you he struggles with commitment, believe him. If he tells you he has patterns of hurting partners, believe him. Don't fall into the trap of thinking you'll be different or that your love will heal him. Don't sign up for a rehabilitation project when you deserve a ready partner. Set clear expectations that self-awareness without behavior change is just self-indulgence. Let him know that you appreciate honesty, but you need to see consistent action that aligns with his stated goals for growth. Don't accept his struggles as a permanent excuse for treating you poorly. And most importantly, don't abandon your own needs and standards to accommodate his process of becoming ready for a relationship. If he's not ready now, wish him well and move on to find someone who is. Toxic habit number 3, premature future planning. The third toxic habit is premature future planning, and it's particularly effective on women over 40 because it speaks directly to desires for security, partnership, and not wasting time on relationships that won't go anywhere. He brings up the future constantly and with specific detail. He talks about trips you'll take together, holidays you'll spend as a couple, how your families will blend, where you might live together, and what your life will look like as partners. He paints vivid pictures of your shared future, and he does this within weeks or sometimes even days of meeting you. For a woman who has spent years, maybe decades, in relationships with men who couldn't or wouldn't commit, this feels like winning the lottery. Finally, a man who isn't afraid of commitment. Finally, someone who sees a future with you and isn't playing games or keeping his options open. Finally, a partner who is on the same page about wanting something serious and long-term. But premature future planning is not the same as genuine commitment. It's a manipulation tactic designed to make you feel invested in a relationship that hasn't yet earned that investment. Here's what premature future planning accomplishes for a toxic man. First, it fast-forwards your emotional investment. When someone paints a detailed picture of your future together, your brain starts to treat that future as real. You begin to see yourself in that vision. You imagine the trips, the holidays, the shared life. This creates emotional investment that is disproportionate to the actual history and foundation of your relationship. You become attached to a fantasy rather than the reality of who this person is and how they actually treat you. Second, it creates an implicit contract that you feel obligated to honor. Once he's talked about your future together, backing out or expressing doubts feels like breaking a promise. You worry about seeming flaky, commitment-phobic, or inconsistent if you later decide this relationship isn't right for you. This keeps you in the relationship longer than you otherwise would stay because you feel like you agreed to something. Third, it distracts you from evaluating the present. While you're daydreaming about the wonderful future he's described, you're not paying attention to how he treats you today. You're not noticing whether his current behavior aligns with the partner he claims he'll be in the future. You give him a pass on present-day red flags because you're focused on the future he's promised. Fourth, it sets up a pattern where words substitute for actions. He talks a great game about your future, but does he follow through on present-day commitments? Does he show up consistently now? Does he prioritize you and respect your time today? Future planning without present-day integrity is just empty promises, but it's easy to mistake the elaborate plans for evidence of serious intent. Fifth, it makes you feel like you're in a more established relationship than you actually are. When someone talks about your 5-year plan together after knowing you for 2 weeks, it creates a false sense of relationship longevity and stability. You start making decisions and compromises as if you're in a committed long-term partnership, when in reality, you're still in the getting-to-know-you phase where you should be carefully evaluating compatibility. Let me tell you about Linda's experience. Linda, 51 years old, met Robert through mutual friends. On their 3rd date, Robert started talking about how he could see himself spending the rest of his life with her. He described the trips they would take to Italy and Greece. He talked about how his daughter would love her and how they could create a blended family. He even brought up where they might eventually buy a house together. somewhere with space for both of their children to visit. Linda was swept off her feet. After a 20-year marriage that ended because her ex-husband couldn't commit emotionally, Robert's enthusiasm about their future felt like everything she'd been missing. She felt seen, chosen, and secure in a way she hadn't felt in decades. Within 2 months, Robert had involved Linda in detailed discussions about their future. They looked at houses online. They talked about which holidays they would spend with which family members. They discussed retirement plans and travel goals. Linda felt like she was in the most serious, committed relationship of her life. But here's what Linda didn't notice. While Robert was great at planning the future, he was terrible at showing up in the present. He frequently canceled dates at the last minute. He rarely followed through on small commitments like calling when he said he would, or helping her with tasks he'd volunteered for. When Linda was going through a stressful time at work, Robert was sympathetic on the phone but never actually showed up to support her in tangible ways. When Linda tried to address these issues, Robert would redirect the conversation to the future. He'd say things like, "I know I've been scattered lately, but once we're living together, everything will be easier." Or, "I can't wait until we're past this early stage and settled into our life together." The focus on the future became a way to avoid accountability in the present. A year into the relationship, Linda realized that none of Robert's future plans had materialized into actual progress. They hadn't taken a single trip together despite all the planning. They hadn't met each other's families despite the talk of blending them. They hadn't moved in together or even discussed a realistic timeline for doing so. The future Robert had painted so vividly was no closer to reality than it had been on their third date. It was all talk, no action, and Linda had wasted a year on someone who was great at promising tomorrows but terrible at showing up for today's. So how do you identify the difference between healthy, future-oriented thinking and premature future planning? Healthy, future-oriented thinking is proportionate to the stage of the relationship. A man who genuinely sees potential with you might mention that he's looking for something long-term, or that he could see things getting serious, but he won't lay out detailed 5-year plans before you've even established basic trust and compatibility. He understands that the future is built on the foundation of the present and can't be rushed. Healthy, future-oriented thinking includes room for your input and your pace. A toxic man using premature future planning tends to steamroll over your natural pace with his enthusiasm. A healthy man will check in with you, ask if you're comfortable with the direction things are going, and adjust his pace to match yours. He'll treat future planning as a collaborative conversation, not a sales pitch you're meant to buy into. Healthy, future-oriented thinking is backed up by present-day integrity. Watch to see if his actions today match his words about tomorrow. Does he show up when he says he will? Does he follow through on commitments? Does he demonstrate through consistent behavior that he's the kind of person who can actually build the future he's describing? Words are cheap. Consistency is valuable. Healthy, future-oriented thinking respects uncertainty. A secure man understands that relationships develop over time and that you can't know everything about compatibility in the early stages. He'll express hope and interest in seeing where things go, without claiming absolute certainty about forever when he barely knows you. He'll acknowledge that you both need time to discover whether you're truly compatible for the long haul. When a man starts planning your future together before he's earned the right to be in your present, slow down. Tell him you appreciate his enthusiasm, but that you need to focus on getting to know each other today before planning tomorrow. Watch how he responds. Does he respect your need to build slowly? Or does he become pushy, hurt, or dismissive of your caution? Your response to premature future planning should be to keep yourself grounded in the present. Don't let elaborate future talks distract you from evaluating current behavior. Ask yourself whether his present-day actions align with the future he's describing. Don't make decisions or sacrifices for a future that exists only in conversation. Don't move your life around. Don't turn down other opportunities, and don't compromise your present-day standards based on promises about tomorrow. Require him to earn access to your future through consistent, respectful, trustworthy behavior in your present. The future is built one day at a time through thousands of small interactions and choices. A man who can't show up well today has no business planning your tomorrow. Toxic habit number 4, subtle boundary testing. The fourth toxic habit is subtle boundary testing, and it's perhaps the most insidious because it happens in tiny increments that seem almost too small to address individually. He pushes just slightly past your stated boundaries, not enough to cause a major conflict, but enough to test whether you'll enforce your limits. He shows up 15 minutes earlier than planned and acts surprised when you're not ready. He extends dates longer than agreed upon and acts disappointed when you need to leave. He calls when you've said you're busy and seems hurt when you don't answer. He makes slightly inappropriate comments and frames them as jokes when you react. For a woman over 40 who has been conditioned through decades of socialization to be accommodating, understanding, and not make waves, these tiny boundary violations are easy to dismiss. You tell yourself you're being too sensitive. You don't want to seem rigid or controlling. You worry that enforcing boundaries will make you appear high maintenance or difficult. You rationalize that these are small things and that he probably doesn't mean any harm. But subtle boundary testing is never about the individual boundary violation. It's about establishing a pattern where your boundaries are negotiable and your discomfort is less important than his desires. Here's what subtle boundary testing accomplishes. First, it trains you to ignore your own discomfort. Each time you let a small boundary violation slide, you send yourself the message that your boundaries aren't that important. You teach yourself to override your instincts and prioritize his feelings over your own comfort. Over time, this erosion of self-trust makes it easier for him to violate bigger boundaries because you've already established a pattern of not honoring your own limits. Second, it establishes him as the setter of terms in the relationship. When he repeatedly pushes past your stated boundaries and you repeatedly accommodate him, you create a dynamic where his needs and preferences take precedence over yours. The relationship begins to revolve around his schedule, his comfort level, and his desires, while yours become secondary considerations that can be overridden if inconvenient. Third, it identifies you as someone who can be manipulated. Toxic men use subtle boundary testing as a screening mechanism. They're looking for women who will prioritize keeping the peace over enforcing their limits. Each time you let something slide to avoid conflict or because you don't want to seem difficult, you're sending him the message that you're an ideal target for escalating manipulation. Fourth, it makes it harder to enforce boundaries later. Once you've established a pattern of flexibility around your boundaries, trying to suddenly enforce them becomes awkward and confusing. He'll say things like, "It never bothered you before," or "You were fine with this last week. Why is it suddenly a problem?" You find yourself in the position of having to explain why something that he's been doing all along is now unacceptable, which is much harder than simply enforcing the boundary the first time it was violated. Fifth, it creates plausible deniability for escalating violations. Because each individual violation is small, he can claim he didn't realize it was a big deal. He can say you never told him even though you did. He can act confused or hurt by your sudden enforcement of boundaries, making you seem like the unreasonable one for being bothered by something he frames as minor. Let me tell you about Margaret's story. Margaret, age 54, met Thomas at a book club. They hit it off and started dating. Margaret was clear from the beginning that she valued her independence and needed alone time to recharge. She told Thomas that she couldn't talk on the phone every day and that she needed at least 2 evenings a week to herself. Thomas seemed understanding at first, but then he started calling just to say a quick hello on the nights she'd said she needed to herself. It was only 5 minutes, so Margaret answered. She didn't want to seem cold or rejecting. Then he started texting throughout the evenings she'd designated for alone time. They were just funny memes or sweet messages, so Margaret responded. She didn't want to hurt his feelings by ignoring him. Then Thomas started suggesting they spend 3 or 4 evenings together per week instead of the balance Margaret had proposed. When Margaret reminded him of their original agreement, he said he thought that was just for the beginning and that surely she wanted to spend more time together now that they were getting closer. Margaret agreed to 3 evenings, not wanting to seem uninterested in deepening the relationship. Then Thomas started showing up at her house unannounced, saying he was in the neighborhood and just wanted to drop something off. These pop-ins always turned into hour-long visits. When Margaret expressed discomfort with this, Thomas said he just missed her and thought she'd be happy to see him. He made her feel guilty for not being spontaneously available. Within 4 months, Margaret found herself in a relationship where she had virtually no alone time, where Thomas seemed to have access to her whenever he wanted, and where her needs for independence were framed as rejection or lack of commitment. Every boundary she'd stated in the beginning had been slowly eroded through tiny violations that seemed too small to fight about individually. When Margaret finally tried to reassert her boundaries, Thomas acted shocked and hurt. He said she'd never seemed to mind before. He accused her of changing the terms of their relationship. He made her feel like she was being unreasonable for wanting the very things she'd asked for from the start. Margaret ended the relationship exhausted, confused, and doubting her own judgment. So how do you recognize and respond to subtle boundary testing? First, trust your instincts immediately. If something feels like it crosses your boundary, even slightly, that feeling is valid regardless of how small the violation seems. Don't talk yourself out of your discomfort. Your instincts exist to protect you, and subtle boundary violations trigger them for a reason. Second, enforce boundaries the first time they're tested, not the 5th or 10th time. When he pushes past a stated limit, address it immediately and directly. Don't let small violations accumulate because they become much harder to address when there's a pattern. Say something like, "I know it seems small, but I need you to respect when I say I'm not available. Please don't call during the times I've set aside for myself." Third, watch his response to boundary enforcement carefully. A healthy man will apologize, adjust his behavior, and respect your limits going forward. He might need 1 reminder, but he won't need 5. A toxic man will make you feel bad for having boundaries. He'll sulk, pout, act hurt, or accuse you of being rigid or uncommitted. He'll push back with guilt trips like, "I just wanted to show you I care," or "I thought you'd be happy to hear from me." Fourth, notice whether he respects your no without requiring extensive explanation. A toxic man using subtle boundary testing will demand detailed justification for your boundaries. He'll want to know exactly why you need alone time, why you can't talk on certain nights, why you don't want him showing up unannounced. He'll act like your boundaries are puzzles he needs to solve or problems he needs to fix rather than limits he needs to respect. A healthy man accepts your no because you said no, not because you've provided sufficient justification. Fifth, be willing to be perceived as difficult rather than be actually uncomfortable. This is huge for women over 40 who have spent decades prioritizing other people's comfort over their own. You need to make peace with the fact that enforcing boundaries might make you seem less flexible, less accommodating, or less easygoing than he'd like. That's okay. In fact, that's exactly the point. You're not looking for someone who likes you because you're easy to manipulate. You're looking for someone who respects you because you respect yourself. Your response to subtle boundary testing should be swift, clear, and non-negotiable. Don't hedge, don't over-explain, and don't apologize for having limits. State your boundary simply and expect it to be respected. If he can't or won't respect small boundaries in the early stages of dating, he will absolutely violate bigger boundaries later. Remember that boundaries aren't mean, selfish, or rejecting. They're essential for healthy relationships. A man who is bothered by your boundaries is telling you that he values his unfettered access to you more than he values your comfort and autonomy. Listen to that message and act accordingly. Toxic habit number 5, strategic comparisons. The 5th toxic habit is strategic comparisons, and it specifically targets the insecurities that many women over 40 carry about aging, attractiveness, and value in the dating market. He compliments you, but includes subtle comparisons that undermine your confidence. He tells you you're beautiful for your age. He says he normally dates younger women but finds you refreshing. He mentions how mature you are compared to the women he usually meets. He praises your body while making passing comments about younger women's bodies. He tells you he's glad you're not obsessed with your appearance like other women your age. These comments are framed as compliments, so objecting to them makes you seem insecure or unable to take a compliment, but they're actually designed to accomplish something very specific. They keep you slightly off balance and grateful for his attention, while establishing him as someone who could have other options, particularly younger options. Strategic comparisons serve multiple manipulative purposes. First, they plant seeds of insecurity. Even though he's ostensibly complimenting you, he's reminding you that you're being evaluated against younger women and that your age is something that could count against you. This activates any insecurities you might have about aging and makes you feel like you need to work harder to keep his interest. You become focused on proving you're different from or better than the other women he could be with. Second, they establish a competition dynamic where you're competing against women who aren't even in the picture. He creates an invisible measuring stick of younger women, past partners, or hypothetical options. This keeps you slightly anxious about your standing and more willing to tolerate behavior you otherwise wouldn't because you feel you need to prove you're worth choosing despite your age. Third, they create gratitude for basic respect and attention. When he reminds you that he could be dating someone younger, you're supposed to feel grateful that he's chosen you instead. This gratitude makes you more likely to overlook red flags, accept less than you deserve, and tolerate behavior that you would normally find unacceptable. He positions himself as doing you a favor by being with you, which inverts the power dynamic. Fourth, they give him leverage for future manipulation. Once he's established that you should feel grateful for his attention despite your age, he can use that implicit message to control your behavior. If you complain about how he treats you, he can suggest that maybe you're not different from those other women after all. If you enforce boundaries, he can hint that perhaps he should look for someone more appreciative, more flexible, more like those other women who would be grateful for his attention. Fifth, they prevent you from accurately assessing your own value. When someone constantly compares you to others, you start evaluating yourself through their lens rather than your own. You stop recognizing your own inherent worth and start seeing yourself as he's positioned you as lucky to be chosen despite your deficits. Let me tell you what happened to Patricia. Patricia, age 48, met Alan through a professional networking event. Alan was 52 and had been divorced for 5 years. Early in their dating relationship, Alan frequently told Patricia she was stunning for her age. He'd mention how most women let themselves go after 40, but Patricia clearly took care of herself. He'd talk about how the women on dating apps all seemed to use heavily filtered photos, but Patricia was naturally beautiful. At first, Patricia was flattered She'd been nervous about dating again, worried that men would find her too old, too ordinary, or not attractive enough to compete with younger women on the apps. Alan's compliments seemed to validate that she was still desirable, but then Alan started making other comments. He'd point out attractive younger women in public and say things like, "She's pretty, but she doesn't have your intelligence or depth." He'd tell Patricia about his ex-girlfriend, who was 10 years younger but immature and high maintenance, implying that Patricia's age made her more appealing in comparison. He'd mentioned that his friends thought he should date younger, but that he preferred a real woman who knew what she wanted. Patricia noticed she started feeling anxious whenever they were around younger women. She'd wonder if Alan was comparing her unfavorably. She'd feel grateful when he chose her company over opportunities to be around younger women. She found herself dressing younger than felt authentic to her, working extra hard to maintain her appearance and trying to prove she was fun and spontaneous, not boring or old. 6 months into the relationship, Alan started using Patricia's age as a weapon during arguments. When Patricia expressed unhappiness about his frequent texting with female co-workers, Alan suggested she was being insecure and acting her age in a bad way. When Patricia wanted to discuss moving their relationship forward, Alan said he wasn't sure she could keep up with his active lifestyle long-term. The strategic comparisons that had started as backhanded compliments became overt tools of manipulation. Patricia eventually realized that Alan had never actually valued her age, experience, or the fullness of who she was. He'd positioned himself as someone doing her a favor by overlooking her age, which kept her grateful, compliant, and afraid to rock the boat. She'd spent months proving her worth to someone who had no intention of truly seeing it. So how do you identify strategic comparisons and protect yourself from this manipulation? First, pay attention to compliments that include qualifiers or comparisons. A genuine compliment stands alone. It's simply, "You're beautiful," or "I'm attracted to you," or "I love your energy." It doesn't need to add "for your age," or "unlike other women," or "considering." If every compliment comes with a comparison or qualifier, he's not actually complimenting you. He's reminding you to be grateful for his attention. Second, notice if he frequently references other women, past partners, or dating options. A man who is genuinely interested in you doesn't need to constantly reference the other women he could be with. If he's bringing up other options frequently, whether real or hypothetical, he's trying to keep you in competition mode, where you feel you need to earn and keep his interest, rather than evaluating whether he's earned yours. Third, watch for comments that praise you while simultaneously highlighting something negative. "You look great for having had kids." "You're fun for someone your age." "You're successful, even though you didn't have the same opportunities as younger people do now." These are not compliments, they're reminders of perceived deficits wrapped in superficial praise. Fourth, assess whether he makes you feel more or less secure about yourself. A healthy partner enhances your confidence. They make you feel appreciated for who you are, not in spite of who you are. If you find yourself feeling more insecure, more anxious about your appearance or age, more focused on proving your value after spending time with him, that's not love. That's manipulation. Fifth, trust your gut when something sounds like a compliment but feels like criticism. Your instincts are excellent at detecting the emotional truth beneath someone's words. If a compliment makes you feel worse instead of better, if it leaves you feeling anxious instead of appreciated, if it makes you want to prove something rather than simply feeling seen, honor that feeling. Your response to strategic comparisons should be direct and unwavering. The first time he makes a comparison that bothers you, address it clearly. You can say something like, "I'd prefer if you'd just tell me I look nice without adding qualifiers. I'm not interested in being compared to other women or evaluated against your past partners." Watch his response carefully. A healthy man will apologize and stop. A toxic man will tell you you're being too sensitive, that you're taking things the wrong way, that he was trying to compliment you, or that you're insecure. He'll turn your legitimate concern into evidence of your problem rather than acknowledging his behavior. If the strategic comparisons continue, end the relationship. A man who needs to keep you slightly insecure to maintain control is not a man who can love you in a healthy way. You deserve someone who sees your age as an asset, not a liability. You deserve someone who values your experience, wisdom, and the fullness of who you've become, not someone who tolerates these things while making you feel you should be grateful for his tolerance. Remember that the right person for you won't make you feel like you're competing for their attention. They won't position themselves as settling by choosing you. They'll make you feel like they won the lottery by getting to be with you, because that's how you should feel in a healthy relationship. Mutually chosen, mutually valued, and mutually grateful for the opportunity to build something together. Toxic habit number 6, controlled emotional revelation. The sixth and final toxic habit is controlled emotional revelation, and it's the most sophisticated of all these manipulations because it combines elements of all the previous tactics while adding its own unique twist. He reveals his emotions in a way that seems vulnerable, but is actually highly controlled and strategic. He shows you specific emotions at specific times to elicit specific responses. He cries when you're pulling away to make you feel guilty. He gets angry when you enforce boundaries to make you back down. He expresses hurt when you spend time with friends to make you choose him. He shares joy and affection when you're considering leaving to make you question your decision. For a woman over 40 who values emotional intelligence and authentic connection, this can be incredibly confusing because it looks like emotional availability. He's crying, sharing feelings, and being real. How could that be manipulative? But controlled emotional revelation is not the same as genuine emotional expression. It's the strategic deployment of emotions to control your behavior and the relationship dynamic. Here's how controlled emotional revelation works. First, the emotions are always in service of getting what he wants from you. Notice that his emotional expressions consistently push you toward behaviors that benefit him. His tears come when you're asserting independence. His anger emerges when you're enforcing boundaries. His joy and affection appear when you've given in or when he needs you to stay. His emotions serve as tools to shape your behavior rather than as authentic expressions of his inner state. Second, the emotions are disproportionate to the situation. He doesn't just feel disappointed when you make plans with friends. He's devastated. He doesn't just feel hurt when you disagree with him. He's crushed. The emotional intensity is deliberately excessive because it makes you feel like you've done something terrible by having normal needs or disagreements. This disproportionate emotional response makes your reasonable behavior seem unreasonable. Third, the emotions shift rapidly and conveniently. Watch for men whose emotional states change dramatically and quickly based on what they need from you in any given moment. He's furious one minute and then perfectly calm and rational the next when it serves him to switch. He's deeply hurt until you apologize and give in, and then he's suddenly fine. These rapid shifts indicate that the emotions are strategic performances rather than authentic experiences that take time to process. Fourth, his emotions always center the focus on him rather than on the issue at hand. When you try to discuss a problem in the relationship, his emotional response redirects the conversation away from your legitimate concern and onto managing his feelings. You end up comforting him instead of addressing the issue. You end up apologizing instead of having your concerns validated. The problem never gets resolved because his emotional reaction prevents you from having a productive conversation about it. Fifth, His emotions make you responsible for his well-being in a way that exceeds normal partnership. You start to feel like you're walking on eggshells because you never know which of your normal behaviors will trigger an emotional response. You begin to manage your own behavior not based on what you need or want, but based on what emotional reaction it might provoke in him. You become responsible for his emotional regulation, which is a burden that should never fall entirely on a partner. Let me tell you about Susan's experience. Susan, age 55, met Richard online. Richard presented himself as an emotionally available man who had done extensive therapy and knew how to communicate about feelings. For the first few weeks, Susan was impressed by Richard's willingness to share his emotions and have deep conversations about the relationship. But then Susan started to notice a pattern. Every time she needed time to herself or made plans that didn't include Richard, he became sad and withdrawn. When she asked what was wrong, he'd share that he felt like she was pulling away, that he was afraid she wasn't as invested in the relationship as he was, and that he couldn't bear the thought of losing another person he cared about. His eyes would well up with tears. His voice would crack with emotion. Susan would feel terrible. She'd reassure him, cancel her other plans, and spend time with him instead. She told herself that he'd been hurt before and just needed extra reassurance. She prided herself on being understanding of his emotional needs, but the pattern escalated. When Susan wanted to discuss concerns about the relationship, such as how quickly things were moving or her need for more balance, Richard would become emotional. Sometimes he'd get tearful and say he was just trying his best and didn't know what more he could do. Other times he'd become angry, raising his voice and saying Susan was being unfair and not appreciating his efforts. Susan found herself backing down, apologizing and dropping her concerns to avoid these emotional scenes. A year into the relationship, Susan realized she couldn't have a single conversation about her needs without Richard having an emotional response that derailed the discussion and left her comforting him or backing down. She'd lost friendships because she could no longer handle Richard's reaction when she spent time with others. She'd stopped pursuing hobbies and interests that didn't include him because his hurt feelings weren't worth it. She was exhausted from managing his emotions while her own needs went entirely unmet. When Susan tried to end the relationship, Richard cycled through every emotion in rapid succession. He cried and begged her to reconsider. He got angry and accused her of leading him on. He became cold and distant to punish her. He switched to love and affection when he sensed her resolve weakening. Susan realized that Richard's emotional displays had never been about authentic feelings. They'd been about control. He'd weaponized vulnerability to manipulate her behavior from day one. So how do you recognize the difference between authentic emotional expression and controlled emotional revelation? Authentic emotions are consistent with the situation and proportionate to the trigger. A healthy man might feel disappointed if you can't make a date, but he won't be devastated. He might feel hurt if you've genuinely done something hurtful, but he won't be crushed by your need for independence or your disagreement with his opinion. His emotional responses will match the weight of what's actually happening. Authentic emotions allow space for your feelings too. When both people in a relationship have legitimate emotional responses to a situation, a healthy partner will create space for both experiences. He won't make his emotions so overwhelming that yours get lost or dismissed. He'll be able to say, "I feel hurt by this, and I want to understand how you're feeling too." His emotions won't eclipse yours. Authentic emotions lead to resolution and growth. When someone expresses genuine hurt or anger or disappointment, the goal is to understand what happened, make repairs if needed, and move forward. A healthy man uses his emotional expression as a pathway to deeper understanding, not as a manipulation tool. After the emotion is expressed, you should feel closer and more understood, not more guilty and controlled. Authentic emotions respect your boundaries even when they're inconvenient. A healthy man might feel sad when you need space, but he'll respect that space anyway because he values your autonomy. He won't use his sadness to make you change your mind or give up what you need. His emotions might be real, but he takes responsibility for managing them rather than making them your problem to fix. Authentic emotions don't create a pattern where you're always the bad guy. In a healthy relationship, both partners sometimes disappoint each other, both sometimes need to compromise, and both sometimes cause hurt, even unintentionally. If his emotional responses consistently paint you as the person who hurts him, who lets him down, who doesn't care enough, that's not authentic emotion. That's manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Your response to controlled emotional revelation should be to maintain your boundaries regardless of his emotional state. This is incredibly hard, especially for women who have been socialized to prioritize other people's feelings. But it's essential. When you need space, take it even if he cries. When you need to enforce a boundary, enforce it even if he gets angry. When you need to end the relationship, leave even if he begs. You can acknowledge his feelings without changing your behavior. You can say, "I understand you're upset, and I'm sorry you're hurting, but I still need to do what's right for me." You don't have to become cold or heartless, but you do have to prioritize your well-being over his emotional reactions. Pay attention to whether his emotions lead to productive conversations or to you abandoning your needs. Pay attention to whether you're walking on eggshells trying to avoid triggering his emotions. Pay attention to whether you feel emotionally exhausted from managing his feelings. These are all signs that his emotional expression is controlling rather than authentic. Remember that emotional availability is wonderful, but emotional manipulation disguised as vulnerability is dangerous. A truly emotionally healthy man takes responsibility for his own feelings. He shares them honestly without using them as weapons. He can be hurt without making you responsible for fixing that hurt. He can be disappointed without making you feel guilty for living your life. He understands that his emotions are information for him to process, not problems for you to solve. We've covered a lot of ground today, and if you're feeling overwhelmed, that's completely normal. Learning to recognize these 6 toxic habits: intense instant intimacy, strategic self-deprecation, premature future planning, subtle boundary testing, strategic comparisons, and controlled emotional revelation can feel heavy, especially if you're recognizing patterns from your own experiences. But here's what I want you to understand. Knowledge is power, awareness is protection, and recognizing these patterns doesn't mean you need to become cynical, suspicious, or closed off to love. It means you get to date with your eyes wide open, trusting your instincts and knowing that you deserve better than manipulation disguised as romance. Women over 40 bring so much to relationships. You bring wisdom earned through experience. You bring emotional maturity developed through years of navigating life's complexities. You bring clarity about what you want and what you won't tolerate. You bring financial independence, established identities, and the confidence that comes from knowing who you are. These qualities make you an incredible partner for the right person. The right person won't use any of the 6 habits we discussed today. The right person won't rush you into intensity or pressure you to ignore your instincts. They won't play on your insecurities or test your boundaries. They won't make you feel like you need to prove your worth or be grateful for their attention. They'll build trust slowly through consistent, respectful behavior. They'll match their actions to their words. They'll respect your boundaries without requiring extensive justification. They'll see your age as an asset, not a liability, and they'll share emotions authentically without using them as tools for control. You don't have to settle for less than this. You don't have to accept toxic behavior because you're afraid there aren't enough good men out there or because you worry you're too old to be choosy. The scarcity mindset is one of the biggest traps for women over 40, and toxic men know how to exploit it. They know how to make you feel lucky to be chosen instead of recognizing that they should feel lucky to have access to your time, energy, and heart. So here's what I want you to do after watching this video. First, if you recognize any of these patterns in your current relationship, trust that recognition. Your instincts are trying to protect you. Don't talk yourself out of what you're seeing. Don't make excuses for behavior that makes you uncomfortable. And don't stay in a relationship hoping he'll change. These patterns don't get better on their own. They escalate. Second, if you're single and dating, use this information as a filter. When you meet someone new, watch for these patterns in the early stages. Don't get swept up in intensity or promises about the future. Pay attention to how he responds when you enforce boundaries. Notice whether his compliments uplift you or subtly undermine you. Evaluate whether his emotions are authentic expressions or strategic tools. Give yourself permission to walk away at the first sign of these toxic habits, even if everything else seems perfect. Third, do the inner work to build your own confidence and self-worth independently of external validation. The strongest protection against manipulation is a solid sense of your own value. When you know what you bring to the table, when you recognize that you're the prize, when you understand that your age is power rather than liability, you become much harder to manipulate. Toxic men target women who doubt themselves. Don't give them that opening. Fourth, surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth. Have friends who will gently point out red flags when you're too close to the situation to see them clearly. Be that friend for others. Create a network of women who support each other in maintaining standards and trusting instincts. We're stronger together than we are alone. And finally, don't let bad experiences make you bitter or closed off to love. Yes, there are toxic men out there who use these manipulative tactics, but there are also good men who are capable of healthy partnership, genuine respect, and authentic love. The goal isn't to protect yourself so thoroughly that no one can get close. The goal is to protect yourself wisely so that the right person can get close while the wrong people are kept out. Before you go, I need to ask for your help in spreading this message. If this video resonated with you, if you learned something that could protect you or someone you care about, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference in helping this content reach more women who need to hear it. The algorithm favors videos with high engagement, and every like you leave helps another woman discover information that could change her life. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, your experiences, or even just letting me know you were here. Your comment creates community and helps other women feel less alone in their experiences. It's also how we learn from each other and support each other through the complexities of modern dating. Share this video with the women in your life who are dating or might start dating again. Send it to your recently divorced friend. Share it in your women's group. Post it on your social media. You never know whose life you might impact by simply clicking that share button. We're all in this together, and we need to look out for each other. If you haven't subscribed to the Heart Code yet, please do that now and turn on notifications so you never miss new content. We post regularly about relationships, psychology, self-worth, and navigating life as a woman who refuses to settle for less than she deserves. Every video is designed to give you practical tools and deep insights that you can use immediately in your life. And for those of you who want to go beyond just watching and really support the work we do here, consider leaving a super thanks. Your financial support, no matter the amount, allows us to continue creating comprehensive, well-researched content without compromise. It means we can keep prioritizing your well-being and education over clickbait and sensationalism. Every super thanks contribution directly supports our mission of empowering women with truth, wisdom, and practical guidance. I also want to remind you that you're not alone in this journey. Dating after 40 can feel isolating, especially when you're trying to navigate the complexities of modern relationships while carrying the wisdom and wounds of past experiences. But there are millions of women just like you who are figuring it out, learning, growing, and refusing to settle. You're part of a community of strong, wise, beautiful women who know their worth and are committed to finding genuine love without sacrificing their dignity or sanity in the process. Take what you learned today and use it. Trust yourself. Honor your boundaries, value your time, recognize your worth, and know that the right person for you will never require you to ignore your instincts, compromise your standards, or question your value. The right person will enhance your life, not consume it. They'll respect your boundaries, not test them. They'll celebrate your age and experience, not use them against you. And they'll show up consistently with actions that match their words. You deserve this. You deserve healthy love. You deserve genuine partnership. You deserve someone who sees your fullness and treasures it. Don't settle for less, no matter how charming the package, how intense the connection, or how much he promises about the future. Thank you so much for being here and for trusting me with your time today. I'll see you in the next video where we'll continue exploring the psychology of relationships and how to navigate them with wisdom, strength, and self-respect. Until then, remember your worth. Trust your instincts and never apologize for having standards. You've earned the right to be selective, and the right person will appreciate that about you. Take care of yourself. You matter more than you know.